Having spent over 50 hours in Clair Obscur Expedition 33 and absolutely loving this game, here are 7 things I wish I knew when I started it. Now we're going to dive right on in, but if these tips are helpful to you, then consider liking the video and subscribing to the channel. So first things first, learn to parry. When you're fighting in Expedition 33, you're not just encouraged, it's actually mandatory to learn how to evade attacks in order to not just get killed on the spot. And there are a few ways of doing it, but the primary two are dodging and parrying. Dodging is definitely the easier of the two to do, as it has a significantly larger window of invincibility frames, meaning it'll definitely help you survive, and it can even have you gaining AP to use on your next turns through the dodger picto earned really early on in the game if you can perfect dodge. However, while it is harder to do, parrying is significantly more beneficial if you learn enemy attack patterns well enough to do it consistently. And if you're getting perfect dodges consistently, you should be able to do this as well. You gain AP for each time you successfully parry, as opposed to the single one you get in a turn for a perfect dodge, and if you can parry the full chain of enemy attacks in a turn, you'll get a counterattack. And believe me when I say, the damage on counterattacks is so big that it's easily well worth your time. The sooner you can consistently pull these off, the easier a time you'll have with the game as it gets harder. And boy, it gets harder. This is of course not to begin to mention the number of weapons and pictos that directly benefit from parries specifically, so trust me, it's in your best interest to get this skill down as early as possible. Next up, you need to keep your eyes open. While you're exploring the continent and all of the dungeons and areas within the game, certainly while you're progressing through the story, you want to explore every nook and cranny in each area you enter. Some of the items you come across, particularly the shards that increase the number of healing items you can carry and those that improve those items' capabilities, are well worth finding. They're extremely easy to miss, believe me, I had to go back to each of the areas multiple times to comb for these, and I still haven't found them all. Predominantly because I'm well known for my lack of observation skills, so don't make the same mistake I did. Speaking of those items, don't be afraid to use them. Expedition 33 doesn't function in the same way as most JRPGs and games like this. You really don't have to worry about elixir hoarding syndrome, as it's colloquially known, as items function more similarly to Dark Souls than anything, as every time you go to a checkpoint, all of your items will be restored. So if you think you might have a need to boost your AP for a turn, go ahead and do it. Every free action you can take in this game matters. So you'd think that in a game inspired by the JRPGs of our youth, that to say this would be an obvious thing to say, but you want to fight as often as you possibly can. In order to gain experience for your characters, you need to fight stuff, but there's actually a lot more benefit to fighting as often as possible in this game than you might think. There's a lot of equipment pieces in Expedition 33 that are dropped by enemies that you fight. Weapons that have a lot of unique qualities, materials to upgrade those weapons, as well as pictos that not only give you new abilities to learn, but also act as stat buffs, so you'll want to update these as often as you can, certainly if you're playing on the game's harder difficulties. Those harder difficulties are the other part of why I think it's important to fight as often as possible. Tying in with what I said about learning to dodge and parry efficiently, if you aren't fighting as often as possible early on, you're not going to learn the patterns of enemies that make it easier on you at the beginning, so that when you fight harder ones later, you don't get completely blindsided and demolished because of it. Now, you can change the difficulty of Expedition 33 at any time, and making the game harder early can actually help you to get the timings down well, because they're strict as all hell on expert difficulty, so if you can nail that timing, you're good to go for the rest of the game. But if you don't want to put yourself through that, there's no shame in changing the difficulty down if you're on a fight you're struggling with. And on story difficulty, the window for dodging and parrying, as well as the damage you take if you miss, are much more forgiving, and you can always change it back up again if you think it's too easy. Don't be afraid to experiment in Expedition 33. There are a lot, and I mean a lot, of skills and abilities, weapons and pictos to obtain in the game, as I stated in the previous entry on this list, but it's totally fine to play around with all sorts of different builds with different characters. As you progress through the game, you'll obtain the item Recall, which is used to reset stat distribution or skill point allocation, so that you can try a different angle if you're not happy with what you've currently got going on with any particular character. And these items aren't as rare as you might think either, so while you can't do it all the time, at least not in the early stages of the game, if you acquire a new weapon that has scaling on a different stat than what you're currently invested in, or a set of pictos that you think will go really well with certain skills, don't be afraid to use these. In fact, you didn't hear this from me, but at the end of the game, these are actually farmable if that's any indication of how usable these items actually are. The same actually goes for the abilities and Lumina points as well. Once you've learnt an ability from a Picto by fighting with it equipped in 4 battles, that ability becomes available to everyone in the party. So as long as you're fighting as often as possible and keeping your eye out for Pictos on the ground, as I've said before, you'll have all sorts of abilities that can draw you into various builds. As for the color of Lumina items you obtain throughout the game that give more Lumina points to enable equipping these skills, I'd advise against feeding them all to one character, but if you wanted to give a few more to the characters you're going to use more often, there's nothing wrong with that. So you want to try to level everybody, but you also want to consider roles and team composition that you want to end up with by the end of the game. In my experience with Expedition 33, different characters are strongest at different points in the story. For example, I used Ciel, one of the characters obtained relatively early on in the story, a ton due to her ability to feed AP to other characters in the party with one of her skills, and that ability stays strong pretty much throughout the entire game. But as I obtained more gear that sped up my characters, I felt I needed to use abilities like that less and less, so I had the choice of either swapping Ciel out for a different character entirely or changing her skill set to suit these new needs. You can only equip 6 skills to each character at any given time, so consider what you're going to be using that character for when you put them in your party. Similarly to Ciel, Lune, the first character you obtain, I didn't actually use all that much once I acquired more than the first couple of party members, at least to begin with, as I felt that her elemental attacks as a mage were too easily blocked by certain enemies, and her unique trait of piling elemental stains to augment her attacks didn't have as much payoff as I would have liked, but by the time I got to endgame, she became a mainstay in my party, as a support option, and one that could deal a heck of a lot of damage at that. So my main suggestion here is that if you find you aren't using a character very much at any point, consider revisiting them later, as their role can be changed up pretty drastically. This next entry covers mechanics that don't start until about a third of the way into the game, so if you don't want to continue watching at this point, I absolutely respect that, and I thank you for joining me up until this point. So consider this a mild spoiler warning, if you will. The same could be said of the last entry too, so consider yourself notified. As you progress through the game, you'll unlock attacks for each character known as gradient attacks, which serve as this game's kind of limit breaks as such. They're very powerful, but the biggest thing about them is that they don't actually take up your turn to use them. They're completely free, and you can attack again after using them, which is something you can very heavily use to your advantage. You also don't retain the gradient gauge between fights, so feel free to use them as soon as you're able to. Let's take Mayel as an example. Best girl, we love Mayel. Her mechanics revolve around the stances that she's currently in, and each of her skills puts her in one of 3. Defensive stance, where she deals less damage but gains more AP for successful parries, offensive stance, which has her deal and take 50% more damage, and virtuose stance, which is a neat 200% increase in damage, but it's harder to get to. Mayel's level 1 gradient attack, Virtuous Strike, does a respectable amount of damage, but puts her in virtuose stance, meaning that the follow-up turn can deal a heck of a lot of damage, and you can use skills that gain additional benefits from being in virtuose stance with next to no effort. Now, I'm not going to put any gameplay footage here, nor am I going to give too much detail about this, but all I'll say for my final tip here is this. The end of the story is not the end of the game. There is an absolute plethora of activities to do once the credits have rolled, and as I said at the very beginning of this video, I've done well over 50 hours with this game, loving it from start to finish, and I'm still nowhere near done with it yet. So that's all for my tips for those starting Expedition 33, and I hope that you've enjoyed this video. If you have, a thumbs up and a subscribe would be massively appreciated, and if you have any questions about the game, do let me know in the comments and I'll try and answer any questions you might have. My next planned videos for this game are going to be deep dives into each character individually, so if that's interesting to you, then stick around. If you'd like to chat to me live about Expedition 33, I'm not streaming the game itself right away as I want people to experience it for themselves, and obviously I've already finished it, but you're welcome to come and find me on TikTok and Twitch if you want to chat about this or any other game. My Discord is open in the description box below for you, and if you'd like to support the channel further, my Patreon is linked down below too. But for now, thank you so much once again, and I'll see you in the next video. Take care.